Hello and welcome to the Domino Theory. I am your host, Rick Doherty. I am very excited about today's conversation. I'll be talking with Colm Larkin, author of the book Dylan Revisited, Busy Being Born. Colm, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Rick. Delighted to be on the show.
So, as we get started, let's just get into what is the thesis of this book? What are you trying to accomplish? You're talking about Bob Dylan in a very specific point in his life, 1960 to 1966, but you're taking a more detailed look into Bob Dylan at that time.
Yeah, so I guess this period of his life, the story has been told a lot. So it's, trying to find a different approach to it. And I kind of started just when I was started going through a lot of the early recordings, just revisiting them and looking at them and, from albums to bootleg stuff to live things. And, with Dylan, there's just so much material. There's so many bootlegs out there of home recordings and live recordings at small cafes. So it was just kind of revisiting all of those, kind of reviewing them, seeing the songs he was playing, but then using each of them to tell stories about different aspects of his life, different people he met along the way, and kind of having this more of a different view of the Dylan story than the kind of the straight autobiography or the straight kind of run through the studio albums or something like that. So it's kind of taking all those little extra elements and throwing them in there so you get to meet this like vast array of cast of characters and hear about different stories and these same stories but through different perspectives and different lenses.
I feel like Bob Dylan is an artist who really wants to let the music do the talking. He famously, invented stories about his past and definitely tried to keep anybody in the press or in the media from really getting to know him because he wanted to let the music do the talking. But I think in all of that, he ended up getting people so obsessed with his personal life and with him as this persona himself that it almost distracted from the songs. And you do a great job with this book by sort of steering people back to the actual songs and maybe a little bit more what Dylan wanted people focused on at the time.
Thank you for that. That's very kind of you to say. Yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, just for example, like the Woody Guthrie element to the Dylan story. Kind of, that's a very common theme that runs through it. Everybody knows it. But so one of the ways I approach it is there's a chapter on a very early festival appearance. It was called the Indian Neck Folk Festival and was early 1961, after, just a couple of months after he'd gone to New York for the first time. And he went to that festival. He wasn't like on the bill or anything. He just went up there and there's a tape of him playing three Woody Guthrie songs. So a kind of the chapter is just about the songs, like there's talking Colombian, talking Fisherman's Blues, or and just why he played them, who he played them with, and it's kind of, so it's the kind of Woody Guthrie angle on him, but then through those songs that he played, and then it's the same thing with one of the Minnesota tapes where he comes back and he's kind of talking to the guys about, oh, I played Passage of Plenty, and Woody Guthrie told me that I played it better than anybody. So it's kind of really focusing in on the songs he played. And I think the thing I've discovered when I was doing all of this is that, Bob Dylan is, he has all the songs that everybody knows, but then he'll do cover, he'll like play some song, traditional song. And then when you start researching that, you're going down this whole rabbit hole of who played it and who they were and what, and that's kind of, I think, in many ways, what he wants to happen with this music is that it becomes this portal for discovering all these old blues songs, all these old traditional things. And, you see that even in his, later stages when he went back to doing in the 90s, his folk covers albums, that he's always been about, it's not just about him, it's about the people who have come before him and how he takes pieces of their music and makes his own music from that as well. So yeah, all about the songs.
I think a great example of that is Blind Willie McTell. And this is a song, actually, the last time I saw Dylan in concert, he played it, and I was so excited to get the chance to see this. And it is a song that is rooted in older folk traditions, and he adapts and he adds to it. So a lot of times people talk about Bob Dylan as an artist that, oh, he's a great songwriter, but oh, his voice isn't that good, or he's, not a great musician. But in a lot of these situations, he is taking something old, and through his unique voice and through just adding some lyrics, he's taking an old folk song that nobody would have ever heard, or old traditional songs, and updating them, making them new, even sometimes without changing the lyrics. He's
Yeah.
making them more relevant to the current time.
Yeah, and there never seems to be any point where he doesn't do something new with a tune he might have borrowed, or even a set of, lyrics he's taken from here and there. I know there's some great stuff. Like Pete Seeger once said, he was talking about when he got into the folk tradition, he learned very quickly that, folk is about, it's not a static thing, even though it kind of feels like they're these old songs that are never changing. He's like, no, everybody who plays these songs, when you're not in a recording studio or not playing live shows, if you're just sitting around, playing music, you're remaking those songs every time. You're adding new bits, you're changing them, for your audience. And, so that was kind of Seeger's viewpoint. And then Dylan came along and basically did the exact same thing. It was from very early, one of his early songs, Song to Woody, is very much based on one of Guthrie's own songs, and a 1913 Massacre. The melody is based on that, and he takes lyrics, snatches of lyrics from Passages of Plenty, and he is just. But at the end of it, it never sounds derivative. It always sounds something new, and so he kind of keeps the traditions alive, far more alive than you ever would by treating them as museum pieces.
Absolutely. Recently, there has been a little bit of a I don't want to say controversy, but Paul McCartney has been touring for a new album, and he's been doing the press circuit. And he talked about going to see Bob Dylan now, and how he wants to see him play some of the hits. Like if you went to see Def Leppard play the State Fair, I guess. But Bob Dylan doesn't do that anymore. I often joke that was back when Bob Dylan got booed for playing like a Rolling Stone, and before he got booed for not playing like a Rolling Stone. What do you think about these arguments that if you go to see Bob Dylan now in concert, he might play one or two songs that are quote unquote the hits, and he'll play them in a way that if you're a casual observer, you might not even recognize that he's playing All Along the Watchtower or Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. And he kind of asks a little bit more from his audience than a lot of other legacy acts who are still touring. What do you think about that balance from him?
Well, I've definitely had that experience. One of the first times I went to see him, I was sitting next to my friend, and about a couple of minutes into a song, I nudged him and went, "I think this is Blowing in the Wind." And, that the most iconic song, and you still couldn't quite. It was like, no, I think it is, yeah. But so I totally understand that for some people is very unsatisfactory. And one of the last times I saw him in the Rough and Rowdy Ways tour, I got talking to the guy next to me, and you could tell he was just very disappointed. He didn't really know some of the new songs. He wanted to just hear the hits done as they're expected to do. But then again, this is Bob Dylan. He's not about, don't look back. He's not about looking back. He's always in this, as he says in No Direction Home, in that film, he says, an artist is always in the state of becoming. And that's kind of one of the reasons why my book is subtitled Busy Being Born, because it is about this process of, he never stops being born. He never stops reinventing himself, remaking himself. And so I think that, it applies in the live arena. And I think I personally really value it, because I think, especially these days, it seems like you can't move for nostalgia acts. You can't move for, like, everywhere. There's always somebody's coming back and they're bringing the shows back. And that's really good fun if you like that band and you want to go and see them. But to have somebody who's 85 years old and is still out there being so creative, so, just always looking forward, always looking to do something new, there's got to be space for that as well. And I think as for Paul McCartney, I think he's been quite clever because he's kind of creating a little bit of a controversy. But it also, it says a lot about McCartney. McCartney has always been this kind of genial guy who wants to make people happy. And so, of course, when like a couple of years ago, he did this big set at Glastonbury, and it just looked like the most magical thing of everybody singing along to Hey Jude and having the time of their life. But, he's just a very different artist to Bob Dylan. And I kind of would never want Dylan to come back and do the hits the old way. And to be honest, I don't think he could because his voice is not the same voice as before. It would probably actually be a very disappointing experience if he suddenly tried to sing like a Rolling Stone the old way, because you'd go, oh, he can't hit the notes. But whereas he does, because he does a lot of the Rough and Rowdy Ray songs, or he does old songs, but in this new style that he has, everything is attuned to his voice. It's suited to his voice. So it always sounds good.
Bob Dylan was always like that as well. So this period here, 1960 to 1966, this is when most people first learned of Bob Dylan in the larger society. And at that time, he had already made a huge shift. And he was not the same artist at all in 1966 as he was in 1960. And he was already making people upset because of that. So, why don't you talk about that? I know a lot has been written about it, but from your perspective of addressing these individual songs, how did you follow that progression and how people reacted to it?
Sure. Well, yeah. So, I mean, you start kind of with the first album where he's kind of this, cover of old songs or of traditional blues, and he just kind of seems like one of the many types of folk singers that were around the village at the time. But then when he starts writing his own material on the Freewheeling, the second album, you get this kind of sense of, oh, here's, he starts becoming this voice of the generation. This guy is speaking for us. He's saying something new and in a brand new way. But like it's so quick how that changes. So that's May or mid 1963, the freewheeling comes out, and then it's followed about 6 months later with the times there the changing, which is kind of then that's that proper protest era Bob Dylan. But by the last song on that album, Restless Farewell, and I write a lot about it in the book, even though it's actually not a particular favorite of mine, but it's a really interesting song of what it says about him. It's kind of him saying goodbye to all the old stuff. And it's like he's giving you this whole album of protest songs. And but he's, by the end of that very album, he's kind of like, and now I'm done. So he's bidding you farewell. He's kind of, he has all this. And then you get into the next album, Another Side of Bob Dylan. And, as the title kind of suggests, it's this other side, even it's not necessarily, kind of is actually very similar to the freewheeling Bob Dylan, I think. But again, he's got songs, like My Back Pages, where he's saying, I used to believe in lies that life was black and white, so that old kind of way of finger pointing of saying this, this, and this, he's already dismissing that. And the controversy that even that generated was, there were people writing full page articles in Sing Out saying, Bob Dylan is wasting our precious time. And so even then, he's up on the pedestal, and there's already been taken down for just pursuing his own path. People wanted him to be their thing, the thing that they wanted him to be, and he had no interest in that. And so then, goes through the electric phase and the Newport story where, he's doing some acoustic sets at Newport in 1965. And, apparently here's some disparaging comments being made by a blues band from Chicago called the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. One of the Newport organizers, Alan Lomax, kind of made some disparaging comments about their electric sound. And suddenly Dylan's like, right, I'm going to do an electric set and it's going to blow everybody away. And it does. And, it's the most, I still think, one of my favorite things from this period is that opening Maggie's Farm from Newport. It is, just the most mind blowing. It's an assault. It's a proper aggressive in your face performance. That's just like, here you go. What do you think of this? And, just absolutely blows me away every time I watch it. But so again, just these specific songs, these specific performances that say so much and, provoke such huge reactions. kind of incredible that, it's hard to imagine any artist these days having such an impact, driving people so crazy with the things they do.
I like to think of the movie I'm Not There, and when they portray the Newport Folk Festival and Dylan turns around, reaches into his guitar bag or his guitar case, and the entire band reaches into their guitar cases and turns around and they have guns and they're just,
Yeah, yeah,
pulling the
exactly.
guns on the audience. And it was just that much of a shock
Yeah.
to everybody that was in attendance. And I even think they did a good job in the recent movie, the Timothy Chalamet movie, where they do show that reaction from the crowd and how much it really did shake up not just the Newport Folk Festival and pop music, but it really shook up a lot of the country when he made this change. He was an oddity to the press, and he was an oddity to a lot of middle America that they saw him doing these things. And I don't think they realized how important it was in the scene and how controversial it was in the scene, but they knew something was happening,
Yeah.
right?
They just
But
didn't know what it
they
was.
they didn't know what it was, I guess, to quote another song.
Mm.
But when we talk about that change and going electric, if that didn't happen, do you think Dylan is considered the revolutionary artist that he's considered now? If he didn't make that change and continue to evolve throughout his career, as much as Paul McCartney might want to see him play Mr. Tambourine Man the exact same way he played it in the 60s, if he was that artist, I think he might just be somebody who was playing the local club in your town now if he was still playing at all. Because I think it was that evolution that kept him relevant, that made him somebody that you had to follow, that you had to see every time. Because if you are a Dylan fan and you go to see him now, and he plays one of those songs that you've seen a dozen times, it's different and it's something that you have to see and you have to enjoy it. And every night, maybe it's not a good night or maybe it is a great night, but every night is different. So people go to see him 4 or 5 times on a tour. Whereas if he didn't do that adapting, he could have gotten stale really, really quickly.
Yeah, yeah, I mean that's definitely true. Although another thing I often think about is that I don't think in terms of sales, Dylan is actually like that big in, in terms of overall album sales and units shifted and all that. I don't think he's really up there with like some of the giants of music, certainly not compared to the Beatles. And actually, he's probably not as popular as you'd imagine. It's more like the impact is huge, but wide, people like a few songs, but then the widespread, he's not on the level of the Beatles or the Rolling Stones in terms of just, your grandma loving him and stuff like that. So, it could have been that he just became more mainstream and just one of these kind of big legacy acts who could do all that stuff and shift loads of units, but again, he just chose his own. He disappeared, and my book ends at the end of 1966, just after kind of the Blonde on Blonde era, and I kind of end it with this line. This is we've reached the end of an era, but this is Bob Dylan. He gets more than one, but they're all like so different. The kind of the next phase of his life is completely fascinating, but in a totally different way because he kind of goes off grid for a bit and comes back with country albums and things like that. So, it remains endlessly fascinating. And some of it is commercially very successful, but it's never just this kind of rocket ship. It's all very up and down. And so, if he kind of just settled into the one, maybe the kind of protest singer thing, maybe he could have been a bigger act, but then maybe, the world would have moved on without him and he would have just been kind of there, not to, I don't want to disparage Joan Baez, but just that kind of like Joan Baez just did her thing and she's kind of always done the same thing and has, a level of high respect, but it's probably kind of relatively similar. I'm not going to say stale, but she's just Joan Baez and she's known for what she's known for rather than Dylan, who's kind of known for so many different things, so many different kind of exciting evolutions.
Right. And this isn't a music YouTube channel, right? This is a YouTube channel where we're focusing on history. And I think if Bob Dylan wouldn't have adapted, I think we'd still be talking about him on music podcasts and we'd be talking about him on music YouTube channels. But because he adapted so much, because of his change and evolution, we talk about him in history YouTube channels and
Yeah,
history podcasts, and he wins Nobel Prizes because he did evolve. So maybe he's not shifting units, but
yeah,
Paul McCartney, who is still shifting, but Paul McCartney, who is still shifting units, is going to see him in concert and having opinions on it, right? He
yeah.
did something that was almost more important than record sales. I want to get into some individual songs now because this is where I think that it gets really, really interesting, especially with your book. The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. This is one that is really important to me. I live about 90 minutes away from Baltimore. That's where the events of this song happened. Obviously, the story is that Dylan wrote it after being at the March on Washington, and he was just overwhelmed by hearing about the light sentence that was received by this man. So, why don't you talk about that song? Not only the history of the song, but how it was a time capsule of Dylan at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So, as you've kind of set up the song, it's about a guy, a tobacco farmer from Maryland, who was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in the end after it was kind of a series of assaults at this hotel gathering, minor assaults, but ended up that this bar worker called Hattie Carroll suffered a stroke or an aneurysm the day afterwards and died. And, he was charged with that. It was maybe originally arrested on charge of murder, but it was taken down to involuntary manslaughter. And there's, like with any of these things, there's a lot of complexity around the case, but he was given a sentence of 6 months. And, Dylan kind of was given the headlines. I think, one of the, it appeared in Broadside magazine, one of the magazines that he used to write songs for. They kind of encouraged the writing of protest songs. And one of the editors used to get clippings from newspapers and give them to Bob to kind of go, "Hey, would you like to write a song about this?" So I think it's kind of like he was, being kind of fed stuff that maybe would be of interest to him. But so I think you have this story that's kind of a very tragic event, but ultimately kind of a small scale story. But because he wrote this song, and not just like any ordinary song, like a really incredible song, an incredible story about it. It's kind of retained this power throughout time that everybody, now remembers Hattie Carroll and the injustice of it. And it's more, there's again, you can kind of argue with some of the details of his song, whether it's strictly true or not, but that's actually probably not really that important. The point he is making is that this injustice happened because injustice was happening to Black people all over America at the time. So it wasn't, it was representative of the wider picture. And one really interesting thing about the song is that he never actually mentions anybody's race in the song,
Correct.
but you know because of the time that it was written and the period where it's from, exactly what's going on here. So it kind of almost makes that more powerful. And then you have this kind of this. There's a bit of a reportage type element where he's telling the story, but then one thing he really does is kind of connect emotionally with this Carroll character. Not that he knew or anything, but he kind of creates a picture that is really emotionally invested for him compared to some of the other kind of protest songs he had written, which tended to be maybe a little bit removed or objective or making a political point. While he's certainly making a political point, it's it kind of tells about her life, these stories about her life and cleaning up at the table and doing all that kind of thing. So again, you're just painting this picture of an individual, but again, it's the representation of what they would have meant in that period of time in America. The underclass, the servile class. So there's that picture is painted is, it's he's done it so well. It's an exceptional portrait. And then also there's kind of this chorus that's like, "You who philosophize disgrace and criticize all fears." It's kind of looking at the audience then at going, maybe there's a bit of liberal hand wringing that will go on here, and we'll all moan this and bemoan this fact that the sentence was too light, but what are we actually doing about it? And maybe including himself in that as well. So it is, it's kind of this big picture thinking about the whole era and showing it, you know, kind of using the small story in a way to really show the big picture rather than kind of going, I was at the March in Washington and here's a story about that. It's just like actually his response was so particular. I think that's maybe why it had so much more power as well.
And you mentioned him talking about her cleaning things from the table. And there is this great moment, I think it's basically in the middle of the song, where he repeatedly rhymes table with table. And
So,
it completely changes the cadence of the song because it's so unexpected. But then it also adds to the repetition of her duties
yeah.
as a server at this fancy hotel, as a working class woman, as a black woman who was serving these wealthy people at this hotel. And it just hammers home this thought that everything she was doing was so repetitive. And I just can't imagine how he thought to do that and how
Yeah.
that was a rhetorical trick that wasn't used before very often and hasn't been used very often since then. It's a really powerful moment in the song. Something else that I find really powerful in the song is that he does this really snide Bob Dylan-y thing where he changes Zantzinger's name, but so slightly that you might not even notice. He just takes the T out of his name so that he, I guess, has plausible deniability if he gets anything wrong. But it's almost a little more insulting to Zantzinger that he presents it in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I find that really interesting. I often think he probably just did it because it scans better, just Zanzinger sounds better. But there are definitely other, I'm sure he thought of other reasons for it. But yeah, just that, he kind of creates this character of Zanziger that's very just despicable. And maybe the way that Zanzinger rolls off the tongue rather than kind of having that stop of the T in there. But again, it's just like he thinks about all this, but then you hear about the way he writes and works, and you're going, but he's not a meticulous reworker of things for months and months. So it kind of feels so instinctive. And like the table thing is a great point. Like I remember probably one of the first times I heard it, you kind of go, oh, that's a bit silly. He's rhyming table, table, table. But then you start to understand why and what it means and what it signifies. You go, oh, yeah, wow. But again, it's like it feels like he does that so instinctively because that song was by all accounts, written pretty quickly, and it was recorded very quickly, only a couple of months or maybe a month after the March on Washington, and the sentence was handed down. I think maybe it was about 2 months or so. So he's also at that time writing a whole bunch of other songs. So he's not sitting for 2 months just focused on Hattie Carroll and making sure it has all these elements. It's this instinct he has in him inside himself.
And I think
Yeah,
one of the reasons that he has changed songs so much over the years and he has adapted the presentation is because of that quick
yeah,
write, perfect, release. And he does it so quickly that I think he's always continuously building on these songs like most artists do before they record them. But he writes it, gets it ready, records it, releases it, and then 5 months later, he's already changing it. So that's one of the things about Bob Dylan. In the last couple of minutes I have you here, I would really like to talk about my favorite Dylan album, and I think one that gets lost because of the album that comes before it and the album that comes after it. And that's Bringing It All Back Home. That is my favorite Dylan record. I think that especially the second half of that album, you can just put it on and just sit back, put on your headphones, and just be put in such a great mood and just hear every little thing. It's still very simple in that early Dylan era, but you're starting to hear those electric songs, like you said, Maggie's Farm, and it has everything on that record.
Yeah, I probably couldn't agree more. That, from the side A, from just kicking it off with Subterranean Homesick Blues, where you're like, what is this? This is just this avalanche of words just hitting you, and it's all so fantastic, and then it's over. And yeah, those other side, and the thing, I kind of said this in my book, the reason I keep coming back to, and I'll talk about side two in a minute, but the reason I keep coming back to that album is just the two simple songs, which could be even acoustic songs, that are the electric side, but She Belongs to Me and Love Love Minus Zero, No Limit, Over No Limit. Just those two songs are just beautiful, glorious love songs, and with astonishing lyrics and beautiful tunes, and you just go, and these aren't even the big songs on the album. So that's, one of the reasons for me why it's so special. And then you get into that side two, and obviously it opens with Mr. Tambourine Man, and that's the one, I talk a lot about Bob Dylan in my house. Young children constantly roll their eyes at another mention of Bob Dylan, but Mr. Tambourine Man is the song they love, the song they know, the song they're happy to hear. But then you get into something like Gates of Eden, which is just this incredibly surreal world where it's a bit Burroughs. It's kind of this cut up of all different things. It kind of feels like, I talk about it, how it is this cut and paste thing where actually some, like Mr. Tambourine Man, feels kind of inspired or whatever, but this feels like actually this, it doesn't feel like it, but it feels like it's the product of, right, I'm going to put all these words together in this kind of really like craftsperson type way to create these like surreal images. But then when he performs it, it doesn't feel like there's any labor involved at all. It's just this kind of this pure magic. Um, it's All Right, My Money Bleeding, like probably one of my favorite Dylan songs. And I always come back to I'm still revisiting, going through the 70s now and doing all these in-depth stuff about stuff beyond the book. And you have the live 1974 recordings from that tour, and there's, just 20 something, maybe more recordings of live performances, and a lot of the same songs come up. So as you're kind of hearing the 20th, you're kind of going, well, I'm done with that one, but never with It's All Right, Ma. You're never tired of hearing it, even though it's quite a long one as well. You're just, yep, I could listen to that all day. And then Baby Blue, Baby Blue is just this perfect conclusion to all of that. It's just kind of combines elements from all of those three previous songs with the surrealism, the cutting edge, and just the beauty. It's a perfect closer.
One of the things that I loved about the A Complete Unknown sort of media blitz after that movie was released was when Timothy Chalamet was the musical guest on Saturday Night Live, and he did Outlaw Blues, which
That
was
was
this amazing song off of Bringing It All Back Home that really does fall through the cracks. And when you talk about Maggie's Farm, I think there are a lot of Bob Dylan lyrics that stick with people, but if there is one that describes him, I think it comes from Maggie Farm. I try my best to be just like I am, but everybody wants you to be just like them. They say, sing while you slave, and I just get bored. That is the personification of this man at that time, but essentially in the 60 years since then, that has been his mentality as well. So I love how this album captures that shift because
yeah.
it's complete by the next album. But this is when it happens. This is when Bob Dylan makes that transition. So, Colm, I want everybody to go and get your book. So, let everybody know where they can go, how they can order it, how they can get it delivered right to their house.
Sure. Well, I'm going to show you it here. Here it is with that beautiful, matching my print on the background. Yeah, so it's Dylan Revisited, Busy Being Born. It's available on Amazon, hardback, paperback, and Kindle. So there, I would just go and search for Dylan Revisited, and it should pop up. But yeah, thank you very much for having me on.
Everybody, go pick up the book. While you're at it, like, comment, and subscribe. What's your favorite Dylan song? Colm, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Rick.